Picture this. You're walking through the cobbled ruins of ancient Rome. The late afternoon sun casting long golden shadows across the forum. Tourists whisper. Tour guides drone on about emperors and temples. Your eyes fix on a statue in the distance, half buried in ivy, marble skin weathered by time. First you think it's a goddess, but then you look closer. That he didn't just dress him in her gowns and name him as his wife, but altered him, physically, emotionally, completely. Until there was nothing left of who that boy once was. The figure is delicate, draped in silken robes, eyes downcast, almost shy. No, it's one of the most haunting chapters in ancient history. A tale not just of cruelty and control, but of the terrifying lengths people will go to preserve love, even when it's rotted into madness. He was real. He lived. He breathed. And he suffered. But Sporus wasn't a myth. Beneath the titles and ceremonies, the jewels and the silks, was a boy robbed of his name, his body, and his future. The jawline too sharp, the shoulders too square, and suddenly you realize, this statue isn't of a woman at all. Open your mind, and ask yourself, if the most powerful man in the world told you to become someone else, to wear a dead woman's face, speak with her voice, walk in her footsteps, what would you do? But something feels off. It's about identity. What happens when the state decides who you are allowed to be? It's about grief. How love, twisted into possession, can consume everything in its path. And it's about survival. What it means to live inside a role so convincing, even your reflection forgets the truth. But there's a part of his legacy that goes beyond fire and blood, part carved into statues, buried in tombs, and whispered through time. It's the story of how, after losing the one woman he believed he couldn't live without, Nero tried to bring her back. Not through memory, not through mourning, but through manipulation. It's a boy. A beautiful boy sculpted like a bride, cast in stone by a civilization that worshipped power, art, and illusion. And just like that, you're pulled into a story that history tried to forget. What if I told you the most powerful man in the world once fell so deeply into grief, so twisted by obsession, that he tried to resurrect the woman he had lost by transforming a boy into her living mirror? This isn't mythology. This isn't fiction. This is the real story of a Roman emperor named Nero and a young man named Sporus. You might know Nero as the man who fiddled while Rome burned, or the tyrant who murdered his mother. Through Sporus, what makes it all the more disturbing is that no one stopped him. Historians of the time mentioned Sporus only in passing, as if his story was just another curiosity, another footnote in the scrolls of imperial excess. What you're about to hear is not just about emperors and intrigue. Before we begin this descent into shadows, take a breath. Would you refuse, or would you survive? In the beginning, Nero wasn't the monster history remembers. Born in 37 AD as Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, he came from a bloodline laced with ambition, violence, and political gamesmanship. But when he ascended to the throne at just 16 years old, many believed Rome was entering a golden age. The boy emperor was young, vibrant, educated. He slashed taxes through lavish games for the public, and took a personal interest in music, theater, and poetry, rare among rulers of his time. She was mesmerizing, ambitious, sharp, politically savvy, and devastatingly beautiful. To Nero, she wasn't just a lover. She was a mirror of his own grandeur, a symbol of the empire he dreamed of controlling. He began an affair with her while still married to Octavia, scandalizing Rome's elite. But scandal was nothing to a man who thought himself divine. The details remain murky. Ancient historians differ, but they all agree on one thing. Nero struck her during an argument. She died not long after, along with her unborn child. In an instant, Nero destroyed the one person he claimed to love above all else. He refused to allow her body to be burned according to Roman custom. Instead, he had it embalmed and laid in a tomb so ornate it rivaled the temples of the gods. He declared Poppaea divine, instituted a cult in her name, and spoke of her as if she were still alive. Some say it was over his late return from chariot races. Others claim she mocked his singing voice. Whatever the cause, the consequence was irreversible.
Oh.
No one dared remind the emperor of her death. No one dared suggest he move on. But the seeds of his unraveling were already there. He didn't want a memory. He wanted Poppaea again, in flesh and silk, walking beside him, smiling at his music, obeying his will. Raised in the shadow of domineering figures, especially his mother Agrippina, the younger, who orchestrated his rise to power, Nero grew up surrounded by whispers and betrayal. His early reign was marked by manipulation and paranoia, but it was until he met Poppaea Sabina that the line between love and obsession began to blur. A freed slave of the imperial household, raised within the palace walls, he had no family to protect him, no powerful lineage to shield him, but he had something that would seal his fate, a face that resembled Poppaea's. Delicate bone structure, wide, sorrowful eyes, the kind of beauty Romans saw as divine. Poppaea was everything Nero's first wife, the quiet and noble Octavia was not. With Octavia gone, Nero married Poppaea in a ceremony that rivaled the coronation of a goddess. He lavished her with jewels, commissioned busts and paintings in her image, even demanded the Senate honor her with divine titles. He divorced Octavia, exiled her, and eventually had her executed, officially on charges of infertility, unofficially because she stood between him and Poppaea. But beneath the silk sheets and candlelit banquets, something darker festered, and more frequently to the private gardens, the private theaters, the private quarters. But soon the whispers grew louder and darker. For a time, they were inseparable. Poppaea became the center of Nero's universe, his muse and obsession. Poppaea was pregnant with their second child when the fatal rupture came. He hit her, some say with a violent kick to the abdomen, and the blow caused fatal internal injuries. And then something broke inside him. The man who could order executions with a nod, who styled himself a god among men, collapsed into grief so profound it blurred the edges of reality. Court officials were forced to play along with this fiction. Her seat at imperial banquets remained untouched. Servants were instructed to whisper greetings into empty chambers. And in this suffocating cocoon of denial, Nero began to dream of bringing her back. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but physically. And that was when Sporus entered the story. He was perhaps 14, maybe 15. To Nero, it was more than coincidence. It was destiny. He saw Sporus and saw his second chance. At first, there were whispers how the emperor had grown interested in the boy. How Sporus had been summoned more. Nero didn't just want a companion. He wanted a replacement. And for that, Sporus would have to change completely. What began as an eerie resemblance soon spiraled into a full-blown imperial project, one that would reshape Sporus not only in appearance but in identity, body, and soul. Nero had crossed the threshold where grief becomes delusion. And in his mind, Sporus was no longer a boy with a life of his own. He was Poppaea, reborn, reformed, reclaimed from the jaws of death. It started quietly. The boy was assigned new servants, ones loyal not to Sporus but to the emperor. He was moved to more luxurious quarters, closer to Nero's own chambers. Then came the gifts. Robes stitched with silver thread, earrings once worn by Poppaea herself, perfumes imported from Arabia. He was not being courted, he was being sculpted. Tutors instructed him in courtly manners, how to lower his gaze, how to sit without spreading his knees, how to walk in short, graceful steps. He was fed herbs, said to soften the features, pale the skin, widen the eyes. No anesthetics, no antibiotics. Just pain, blood, and imperial command. The imperial physicians were next. Sporus, still barely into adolescence, was summoned under the guise of health checks. A real Roman wedding, with all the sacred rites, legal documents, and grand processions. The court was horrified but powerless. Senators who once advised emperors now nodded and smiled like puppets. Priests of Jupiter recited blessings they barely believed. Musicians played hymns of fertility as if this grotesque union could ever bear fruit. What followed was anything but. Nero ordered a surgical procedure so grotesque, so cruel, that even hardened members of the court were appalled in private. On his fingers, rings that once belonged to Poppaea. On his head, a veil dyed with the same crimson worn by Roman brides. Others claimed he was emotionless, distant, like someone observing his own funeral. Perhaps both were true. Not because he believed in it, but because he had no choice. Every slip of the tongue, every hesitation, could be interpreted as betrayal. And in Nero's Rome, betrayal was death. He was the Empress of Rome, in title, in dress, in duty. At his side, Nero, smiling, triumphant, drunk on power and grief. He mastered the role forced upon him, became so skilled at performing womanhood, submission, elegance, that courtiers began to believe the illusion. Some even forgot he had once been anyone else. It wasn't just a physical alteration. It was a ritual erasure of who Sporus had been, and was expected to respond to affectionate gestures in public, always with the grace and gratitude of a dutiful wife. And deep down, even if no one else remembered who he really was, Sporus did. Behind closed doors, no one knows what was said. But ancient records describe Nero as a man increasingly unmoored from reality. He spoke to Sporus as if he were truly Poppaea, reminiscing about shared memories they never had, referencing events Sporus had never lived. There are no detailed records of how Sporus reacted, no diaries or letters, only silence. That silence screams louder than any cry for help. The goal was simple: to make the boy more physically suitable for his new role as Empress. Imagine servants dressing you in someone else's clothing while calling you by someone else's name. Imagine having to smile when you're dying inside. Castration was not uncommon in Rome for slaves or performers, but this was personal, intimate, invasive. He survived the operation. That fact alone is astonishing considering the brutality of ancient surgery. Once the wounds closed, the transformation accelerated. He wore her gowns, mimicked her gestures, and was even made to read from scrolls that recorded her favorite poems and letters. The servants around him stopped calling him by his real name, called him Sabina, Poppaea's name. He was assigned vocal coaches to soften his speech, make his tones sweeter, higher, more feminine. Every aspect of Sporus's daily life was now curated to mirror a woman he had never met. There was no escape. Rome was the center of the world, and the imperial palace was its gilded prison. But the final step in Nero's unholy resurrection came in the form of a wedding. Yes, a wedding. Nero announced that he would marry Sporus in a full imperial ceremony. No satire, no subtext. Sporus, now fully dressed in imperial bridal garments, walked down an aisle lit by hundreds of oil lamps, trailing incense and silence. Some said Sporus wept during the ceremony. From that day forward, he was no longer a boy, nor even a person, but not in freedom. He traveled beside Nero in a litter, attended state functions at his side, and Sporus. He played the part. Imagine waking up each morning and staring into a polished bronze mirror, your face powdered and rouged to resemble a ghost. He was no longer a human being. It was a canvas, painted over again and again until nothing of the original remained. And yet, he endured. Despite everything, Sporus survived. For months. For years. But that endurance came at a terrible cost. Each passing day carved away another piece of the person he used to be. And that memory of a name, a body, a self that once was his, was the one thing Nero could never take. The spring of 67 AD, Rome shimmered under the Mediterranean sun. But inside the palace walls, the air grew heavier with every passing day. What began as a strange love story, or perhaps a delusion, was now cemented in ritual, spectacle, and fear. The senators bowed, and Sporus, dressed in imperial silks and adorned with precious stones, stood silently at the center of it all, his smile perfectly rehearsed. But beneath the gold and perfume, something was dying. He was a puppet dressed as memory, a doll fashioned from sorrow. To the outside world, he was an empress. Nero paraded him through the streets like a trophy reclaimed from the gods. They traveled together to Naples, then to Greece, ostensibly on a cultural tour. But in truth, it was a retreat from the crumbling stability of Nero's empire. Nero had grown increasingly erratic. He fancied himself a great actor, singer, and charioteer. He demanded applause from dignitaries and imposed voluntary attendance at his performances. He felt like a prisoner in disguise. And Sporus was always beside him, always watching, always watched. The moon was full, and the river shimmered like molten silver. Locals had gathered below to glimpse the emperor. Priests prepared incense. Musicians played softly. "You came back to me," he said, loud enough for all nearby to hear. "We're taken, but now you're here." Perhaps it was the realization that the man beside him didn't love him at all, only the ghost he represented. Others suggest he attempted to run away that night, only to be caught. But most agree on one thing: it was after Egypt that Sporus changed. He no longer smiled unless commanded. He moved mechanically, like a spirit whose body remained but whose soul had wandered off into some distant field where emperors couldn't reach. Or perhaps it was the weariness that comes when even your breath is no longer yours. I defied the gods and they returned you. Generals who once toasted Nero's victories now plotted his downfall. And when the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own bodyguards, declared him no longer fit to rule, Nero was forced to flee. Rumors of betrayal echoed through the marble halls. He would be executed in the traditional Roman style, stripped, whipped, and paraded through the streets before being strangled on the steps of the Curia. They saw the robes, the jewels, the proximity to power, and assumed he had everything. But they did not see the toll. They refused. He didn't dare. A crack. The Senate grew restless. The Praetorian Guard whispered of change, and former allies became wary. Nero's enemies were growing bolder. Wherever Nero performed, Sporus sat in the imperial box, veiled and adorned, clapping on cue, smiling on command. No fanfare, no songs. With the help of a freedman, he drove a blade into his own throat, crying out, "What an artist dies in me!" But as Rome decayed, so did Nero's grasp on reality. He had witnessed too much, known too much, and bore to striking a resemblance to the man whose madness had nearly destroyed Rome. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps it was the twisted bond of trauma. Or perhaps Sporus had nowhere else to go. Watched day and night by servants who reported to Nero. Every word, every sigh, every twitch of emotion was catalogued. He had no visitors of his own, no letters, no private possessions that had not first passed through imperial hands. Behind the performances and declarations of love, the emperor was panicking. And in the midst of this rising storm, Sporus remained silent. No one asked what he felt. No one wanted to know. Nero, once surrounded by senators and slaves, now wandered the corridors like a ghost. He tore at his robes. He wept. He made speeches to no one, rehearsing final words in case he was captured. He was isolated. The world saw a royal companion. One night, while the imperial entourage was docked in Alexandria, Nero took Sporus to a temple overlooking the Nile. Nero turned to Sporus, placing a hand over his heart. Sporus didn't speak, but something shifted inside him. Perhaps it was the river, so wide, so deep, so free. Historians disagree on what happened next. Some claim Sporus leapt into the river, only to be rescued and punished. He stopped speaking unless spoken to. Meanwhile, back in Rome, chaos had reached its boiling point. Revolts flared in Gaul and Hispania. He didn't go alone. Sporus was among the few who stayed with him. Imagine that. The boy who had been reshaped, renamed, and imprisoned in a woman's role. Still loyal, still present, even as Nero ran from the throne he had once claimed like a god. They fled together to a villa outside Rome. The household was reduced to a handful of servants. One morning, a messenger arrived. The Senate had declared him a public enemy. Nero panicked. He begged his last few companions to kill him. He begged Sporus. Sporus, we don't know what he said, but Nero, in the end, found the strength to do it himself. He died bleeding on a dirty villa floor, and Sporus. He lived, but freedom did not come with Nero's death. It's quite the opposite. With the emperor gone, Sporus became a dangerous relic, a symbol of everything the Senate wanted to forget. And so, the tragedy continued. The empire did not rest after Nero's death. Like a severed beast, it thrashed violently in search of a new head. In the vacuum of power that followed, emperors rose and fell in quick succession, each scrambling to establish legitimacy, each haunted by the memory of the man they had just buried, and by those who had been closest to him. His presence was a reminder of the grotesque final chapter of Nero's rule, and yet perversely, that made him valuable. Each new claimant to the throne wanted to control the narrative of Nero's reign, and that meant controlling Sporus. He should have disappeared, slipped into obscurity like so many victims of imperial whim. But he was too visible, too memorable. He took Sporus into his household, not as a witness, but as a prize. He dressed him once more in feminine robes, forced him to appear at banquets as the widow of Nero. He too claimed Sporus, though less as a mockery and more as a symbol. Within weeks he faced rebellion from Vitellius, a brutal general backed by powerful legions in the north. Sporus would play the role of the goddess. His rape and death would be staged for tens of thousands to witness, framed as symbolic purification of Rome's sins. War broke out. Rome descended into open civil conflict. Otho tried to present himself as a continuation of Nero's legacy, young, artistic, flamboyant, and what better prop than Nero's own Empress? In public, Sporus was made to sit beside Sabinus, smiling softly, nodding with choreographed grace. The charade resumed, but this time, with no illusions of affection, only humiliation. Whether he drank alone, quietly, whether he prayed or cursed the gods, or simply sat in silence. But we know this. Others believe he had it prepared in secret long before, anticipating that sooner or later, escape would only come through death. Survived the parade of tyrants who toyed with him like a relic of a fallen god, probably before he turned 20. In a world that had stolen every part of him, he claimed the last decision for himself. The first to seize him was Nymphidius Sabinus, a high-ranking officer of the Praetorian Guard who fancied himself the next emperor. For centuries, he was remembered only as an oddity in footnotes, a tragic symbol of Nero's excess. Sabinus fell not long after, executed by his own troops when his ambitions outpaced his charisma. He was a soldier, a man of appetite and cruelty. To him, Sporus was not a person, just an artifact of Nero's decadence, something to be mocked. And so he planned a public spectacle, a theatrical execution, staged in the Colosseum, meant to amuse the masses and vilify the past. It was a quiet, unspoken chronicle of how power, unchecked, unchallenged, can twist love into ownership, reshape identity into fantasy, and reduce a human life to performance. But in choosing death over spectacle, silence over submission, he made one final statement, whisper loud enough to echo across millennia. Then came Otho, one of Nero's old allies who had once governed Lusitania. But even Otho could not hold power. And still, Sporus was passed from one ruler to another, never consulted, never protected, always used. Under Vitellius, the farce turned crueler. Unlike Nero and Otho, Vitellius had no fondness for poetry or pretense. The plan, according to ancient sources, was grotesque. Vitellius ordered a reenactment of the myth of Proserpina, the goddess abducted and violated by Pluto, god of the underworld. Can you imagine it? After years of being forced to live as a woman, speak as a woman, obey as a wife, Sporus was now expected to die as one, for entertainment. And this time, he would not allow it. In the days leading up to the planned event, Sporus managed to acquire poison. Some say it was smuggled in by a sympathetic servant. We don't know what his final hours looked like. Died by his own hand. He had survived Nero's madness, survived the surgery, survived the ceremony. But when faced with the final degradation, being stripped, displayed, and mocked before a roaring crowd, he chose agency. And with that, the curtain fell. The name Sporus faded from official records soon after. No monuments were built. No coins bore his face. But look closer. What he endured wasn't just a bizarre moment in history. What does it mean to be remembered only as someone else's shadow? To have your entire life reduced to a role you never auditioned for? Sporus may not have been a warrior or a senator or a poet. I am not yours. So here we are, nearly 2,000 years later, still haunted by a name the world tried to forget. Sporus, a boy who was never allowed to be a boy. A victim turned performer, a body repurposed into memory, a life carved into someone else's mold. And yet even as the empire twisted him into a reflection, he never became what they wanted completely. In the end, when faced with a final performance that would have erased him forever, he said no, not with words, not with violence, but with the quietest, most powerful act of resistance. He took back his ending. What do we make of that? Is it a story about love? About how far grief can go when love becomes possession? Or is it a warning, a brutal reminder of how unchecked power consumes everything in its path, even the people it claims to cherish? And how a person can be erased not by death, but by being rewritten, recast, and renamed? Maybe it's both. Maybe Sporus is more than a historical footnote.
Oh.
Maybe he's a symbol of how identity can be weaponized, how trauma can be institutionalized. But if that's true, then remembering him, truly remembering him, not just as Nero's bride, not just as a strange imperial anecdote, is its own kind of defiance. Because when we remember Sporus not as an object, but as a person, we reclaim the humanity that history stripped from him. And maybe we remind ourselves of something else, that no matter how powerful someone is, emperor, tyrant, ruler of millions, there's always a cost to reducing a human being to a role they never chose. So ask yourself, if you were Sporus, if you were brought into the palace, renamed, reshaped, refitted into someone else's past, would you have survived as long as he did? Would you have remembered who you were when that final moment came? Would you have had the courage to say no? We share stories like this, not just to shock, but to remember, to pull the past out of shadow and into the light. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect on power, on grief, on the forgotten lives buried beneath history's headlines, consider subscribing and tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from? Which part of this story stayed with you the most? Because across time, across continents, across languages, we're all connected by the stories we carry. Thank you for listening.